up by presenting Daniel Assisi, who will be talking about past lives, memories as evidence of reincarnation. Daniel Assisi, Doctor of Education, Masters of Public Administration, and Project Management professional, has spoken on spirituality and spiritism throughout the United States and abroad. A founding member of the Spiritist Institute, Daniel has also been an active participant in the Spiritist movement in California for over 15 years. Passionate about education, Dr. Assisi works with public schools in education reform in California and administrations with a graduate certificate in public policy from the University of Southern California. Daniel lives in San Diego with his wife, Nicole, and his son, David. Please welcome.
It was a Sunday morning, maybe much like this one, with a beautiful sun outside. And Tiu was driving her 2-year-old Leah back home in their station wagon. As they drove over a beautiful metal bridge, one of those with aluminum guardrails that shine when the sun strikes it just right, Tiu heard something that she will never forget. Her 2-year-old, Leah, from the top of all her wisdom, matter-of-factly tells her, "This is just like the place where I died." Mom, taken by surprise, of course, asks her, "Sorry, honey, what did you say?" And Leah goes on as if she was chewing bubble gum. "I was driving a car. I fell off the bridge and I died." And Tiu then did what every responsible mom, and all of us should do. She pulled over because she wanted to avoid going to her next incarnation. She first wanted to hear about her child and trying not to be, as parents often do, worried about it, although her heart was probably skipping a beat or two at that moment in time. She looked at Leah and asked, "And where was Mama?" And Leah again simply responded, "Mama wasn't with me that time." And she asked again, "So who was driving?" And by now, Leah was probably a little annoyed and said, "I was driving. I was big. I could reach the pedals." And Tia thought it was really interesting because how could Leah know about pedals? You see, she was strapped in her car seat right behind her while she was driving. She's 2 years old. She never really could have a chance to understand how the car worked, much less that the pedals in front, where she could not see, made them go. And she probed her a little bit longer to understand what was going on, and Leah proceeded to explain that the car had fallen off a bridge like that one, and because she wasn't wearing a seatbelt, she was thrown out of the car. And she continued to explain to her mom how her head eventually was laying in the rock as she looked up. And she saw, she described, a shiny bridge while the bubbles went up. You see, the mom knew something was happening there because, among other things, Leah did not know how to swim or actually had ever been in a pool to see bubbles going up when you're underneath. She wouldn't even put her head underwater when we were taking a bath. And could it have been something that maybe she picked up from TV? No, because Leah had never watched TV before, because Tiu, her mother, wouldn't let her. And so, clearly, something was happening that defied Tiu's understanding of life. There he was, 2 years old, and still. You see, this is just one of many cases. One of many thousands of cases that probably take up much of our lore and reincarnation studies. Happens everywhere to everyone. And what we want to talk about today here, knowing full well that we only have a short period of time, is to provide you with some insights into some really smart folk who have made it their life's work to investigate such cases so that you can investigate them too, if you so please. And on top of that, we also want to make sure that besides providing you with some places to go to get the information that you might want to further yourself in these studies, we also want to provide a different insight into perhaps other ways of looking at facts that might serve as evidence of reincarnation. And we want to tie it all back to a Spiritist perspective as well, because we believe that Spiritism also has a lot to provide to all of us as we understand reincarnation, being that the idea of reincarnation has been interwoven, so to say, with that of Spiritism from its early ages. Does that make sense? And so what we want to do is just spend a little bit of time revisiting this whole concept of reincarnation and past life memories, seeing some folks who could perhaps be resources for us, look at other potential different evidences to reincarnation, see how Spiritism comes in, and ultimately we want to change the question about past life memories as evidence of reincarnation. We want to suggest a new question we should be asking ourselves. So where do we start? Well, in our 101 for reincarnation, past life memories, it's important to say that this case, like we shared, that comes from a very interesting book by one of the people we're going to talk here, Bowman. We find that these memories of past lives come from anywhere in the world, no matter the cultural background or geography. We find that these cases exist, very, very much so. We see them in adults, we see them in children, we see them spontaneously pop up, these memories. We see them being induced through hypnosis. The interesting thing to point out is there's a wide gamut of different opportunities and circumstances in which these memories seem to elicit us to think about past lives. So it's not just circumscribed to a specific place or time, but it is prevalent throughout the world. It is just interesting because in the case of children, for instance, we don't often think about it. We just dismiss that as children being children, but they're very, very much so there as well. And so as we look into past life memories and reincarnation, and we take the next step to understand some of the great exponents of the studies, we want to start with perhaps the greatest scientist in the field that we've seen so far, Dr. Ian Stevenson. Dr. Ian Stevenson founded the Division of Perceptual Studies at the University of Virginia within the Department of Psychiatry. And what's really interesting about Dr. Stevenson, who passed away in 2007 at 88 years of age, is that he was not only a precursor in the field, but he attained his studies to a very academic stance. He was interested in real academic research about this, and throughout his research and his life, he documented more than 3,000 different cases, mainly involving children, and who had spontaneous memories come about. And one particular interest that also fascinated us, and obviously very present in his studies as well, and there oftentimes there was a correlation of some birthmarks in some of the children with the conditions of their previous death, which make it a fascinating study for us. But the way he went about this, and the reason why he preferred working with children, was for a reason that's perhaps obvious to all of us. It is harder for a child to really make a convincing story up and stick with it consistently. Whereas adults, as we can probably tell, do that very well. Children, on the other hand, they're a little bit harder to do it. So what he focused and he and his team focused on was the stories of children who spontaneously recall these memories, and then they would set about investigating the facts that they said, where they lived, what their name was, who they knew. And they would go to these different places in different cities, and this instance here, the farther apart the better, and to verify whether those people really lived. And to their surprise, guess what? They did. So there's thousands of cases that are documented throughout his research that tells us of this incredible gamut of cases of children who spontaneously remember their past lives, tell us about their previous parents, their previous loved ones, husbands and wives, and how they relate. Some of them are fascinating. There is a case of a young girl in Syria who, from an early age, would pick up the phone and just start saying, Lydia, 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 on the phone. When she grew up and she was able to speak a little bit more, she shared to others how she was really calling her daughter Lydia, who had gone out in a car and never come back. Then she eventually offered more information, the names of the people. She actually got to meet her previous husband and some of her other children, and became actually quite possessive over her previous husband. They would call him 3 times a day just to see how he's doing, even though she was 8 years old, because she didn't like very much that he was getting friendly with the neighbor. But these are very interesting but difficult stories for us to normally explain by our current understanding if we are not to bring reincarnation into the mix. But what is fascinating then about Dr. Ian Stevenson's research is that these are rigorous studies performed by staff on a recognized research university that documents over 3,000 cases such as this one. These are not isolated happenstances, but rather a fact of life. And even though he passed away in 2007, his studies still continue. Dr. Tucker and others followed around. But the point here is that Dr. Ian Stevenson says perhaps his seminal work that he published in 1974, 20 cases suggestive of reincarnation, is a good place to start should you choose to dive deeper into the field of past life memories and read about some more interesting cases. There are many other books as well that he wrote that are interesting, but there's a suggestion. Another interesting suggestion as well is Carol Bowman. And Carol's work is really interesting because her book, Children's Past Lives, it was published in 1997, was probably the first non-academic book to really explore this phenomena of children's spontaneous memories. And one great thing about Carol's work is she bridges the gap for the rest of us to understand the research-heavy and academic language that Dr. Ian Stevens has provided us with. And it's great because it's not only an account of some experiences, some of which she actually had with her own children, but also provides parents with resources on how to act and what to do and how to contact other people that might have gone through the same experience as well, so that you can find a very pragmatic and a very useful way of understanding the topic better. After that, she also published another book, Return from Heaven. And one interesting thing about Carol as well is we had actually the pleasure of having her speak to us at one past symposium. So it's really great to see us crossing paths and understanding that reincarnation could be widely talked about and spread in many different fields, whether they be a Spiritist symposium, an academic venue, or simply amongst people having coffee. So Carol Bowman then is another resource that all of us can use should we want to ease ourselves into the topic. And one great thing too about her work is she actually gives us a little bit of an introduction to Dr. Ian Stevenson's work as well. So maybe it's a good place to start if you are not so keen on that academic and a little bit drier language. So far, so good? Okay. So if we were to take another step and talk about other evidence of past life memories and reincarnation, we also ought to talk about adults. Carol's work and Dr. Ian Stevenson's has a lot to do with children and spontaneous memories, but we also shared that there's also adult memories, adult recollections, and some of them can also be induced via hypnosis, via therapy. So we want to take a little bit of time to talk to a figure that's also very well known in the spiritualist realm in general, which is Dr. Brian Weiss. And Dr. Weiss published a book in 1988 called Many Lives and Many Masters that became a bestseller. Which is really interesting about Dr. Weiss is that he didn't start to prove anything. He was just merely conducting memory regression therapy to help his patients deal with traumas that he believed came from an early age. And in the process of coaching them through the hypnotic process, so they could ease themselves into a trance and recall these traumatic memories that were preventing them from emotionally moving forward in their lives, he would guide these parents, these people, to return to the point of that trauma. And it was much to his surprise, you can probably imagine, when, as he led them back into the cause of their trauma, they would start to describe a life that was different than their own. I actually imagine a pause at that moment where he's trying to make sense of probably what's happening when that happened for the first time. But in the process of trying to guide them to their childhood, to find these traumas, some of his patients would normally and accidentally slip back into previous existences in which they would then share the details of, highlighting the traumas that originated the current challenges today. Very interesting as well. And so you find in that book, Many Lives and Many Masters, and then later on another one called Same Soul, Many Bodies, some of the reports that Dr. Weiss has for us about these cases. And of course, he protected names and changed identities. But you can also find, like the other studies, first-hand accounts of past life memories that were induced by hypnosis. Now, if Brian Weiss was probably one of the pioneers on the field of literature, public and more widespread literature in memory regression, another person that's also worth mentioning is Dr. Michael Newton, who published a book called Journey of Souls in 1994. And Dr. Michael Newton's work, in a way, is similar to Dr. Weiss, in that he was also conducting regression therapy to address deep traumas. And his patients also regressed into past lives. But what is really noteworthy, I think, about his work is not only did these parents recount past lives and what the trauma was, but some of them started to recount the in-between lives when they did not have a physical body. So they started to describe what we Spiritists call the spiritual world, which is a fascinating topic as well, because it's a different perspective into the fact that not only does the soul have many incarnations, many bodies, but it also lives in the spiritual planes before it comes into our physical realm with the body, a new body as well, with new clothing as well, as we like to think. So if you're interested in seeing some of that and getting more into that perspective, I invite you to read one of Michael Newton's book, and perhaps that will get you interested in the topic a little bit more as well. All right, so here we are. We briefly looked at different instances of past life memories. Some of them were induced, some of them were spontaneous, some of them with adults, and some of them with children, knowing that scientifically it's always great to have the children and the spontaneous ones because really it's less likely to be something that was manipulated. But we also want to offer that as we get closer to the idea that reincarnation is indeed a reality, whether we have fully embraced it yet or not, it's also interesting to consider that there are other factors that also point to reincarnation. You heard Julia speak here and Vanessa before and many others. But once we start to dive into the topic, and if we hold the belief that there is a God or a divine force or whatever it is, and we understand that God, by definition, or this divine power, is perfect and just, then we also understand that the world that we live in must not be imperfect. That's a tough concept to grasp. But if God is all good and all just, God is all caring, otherwise God would be mean, which means God wouldn't be God. How can you have a mean God? Because God is all caring, God is all just. So when you think about that, then we look at things differently. How can we explain, then, congenital disorders where you were born with a condition as a baby that you had no impact, no influence on? How can you explain, as Julia did here before, the varying levels of natural abilities, child prodigies and so forth, if they had not had a past life? How can you explain that some of us get to live in very healthy family environments and others not so much? How can we fully internalize that some of us are born in very favorable social circumstances where others are not? How can we explain the empathy that we have with people we have never met, and perhaps the antipathies and the dislike we might have with people who are in our own families? If we believe in the idea of a God, it becomes really hard for us to reconcile all of these without understanding that there is reincarnation. Because clearly, we are not starting from the same point in this lifetime. Let's be honest about that. We are the lucky ones to be able to be here today. There are people who will never be able to even have access to what we're talking about right now, or who have lives that are much more difficult than the ones that we have, that are exclusively working towards and worried about making ends meet so that they can eat today, while we are able to take the time to stay in this air-conditioned, or maybe not so air-conditioned room, and talk about topics that speak to our soul and not to our stomachs. We're truly blessed. So, as we believe in God, it necessitates the belief in reincarnation for us to reconcile the apparent injustice we see in the world. If you don't believe in God, then that's a different conversation. But if we do, we ought to bring reincarnation to the forefront of our minds, our souls. That's a different insight into potential other evidence too, but what I feel we must also talk about is this important contribution that Spiritism gives to the idea of memories as it relates to reincarnation. Well, you see, something really interesting happens in Spiritism, which is the concept of mediumship. From the beginning, the whole Spiritist revelation, so to say, was one that was arrived at by research. Kardec never set up to create a new body of knowledge, a new religion. He was simply examining the facts around him and letting them lead him to where they may. And in the process of examining and thinking about this interesting phenomena that were taking place in Paris in the 1850s, he came to understand that they were triggered by spirits, the consciousness of those that had lived before and who no longer had a body. And as he did that, the spirits also told us that it was possible for us to communicate with them, and with time, we developed, or I should say, they developed, the spirits and Kardec, the first and the greatest treaty on mediumship and spirit communication that all of us can understand, which is the Medium's Book. And since then, Spiritists throughout the world have engaged in the practice of mediumship within the Spiritist context and have conversed and talked to spirits in what we call mediumship meetings to help them understand their condition. Some of them are unaware. And for us to also be reminded of our future condition. And as that happens, in our mediumship meetings that happen throughout the world in hundreds, if not thousands of Spiritist groups, every single day, we come in contact with spirits, people just like us, but without a physical body, who tell us of their past lives. So in a way, they also give us their memories of their previous past lives as they prepare to engage in their future life. So if we are also looking for a repeated and frequent experiment or observation where people are constantly sharing their past life experiences, we can look no further than the hundreds and thousands of Spiritist groups throughout the world that are replicating that very experiment every single day as well. Another interesting perspective and another tie-in to how Spiritism and reincarnation are really tightly woven. Because as we look back into trying to understand the world around us and make sense not only of ourselves, but of the spiritual realm, we need to consider, or we ought to consider, the idea of reincarnation. Which, by the way, as we said before, was a word coined by Kardec himself. And that's perhaps the reason why we don't see that before the 1850s, where he was employed with different names. But here's the interesting piece. When we take all these things, when we take the spontaneous memories that some children seem to have and that oftentimes go forgotten by parents or ignored by parents, when we take into consideration the many different studies that take place every day when adults are induced through hypnosis to revert back to their previous lives, when there is a significant trauma that warrants it, so that they can overcome these challenges, and when we think about the logical perspective that reincarnation brings to us when explaining these differences in the world, we begin to truly carve out a special place for reincarnation in our psyche and in our way of looking at the world. When that settles in, we get to an important point where we begin to flip our mindset from one that asks us, is there reincarnation, to what is it that we should do when we realize there is reincarnation? And that is one of the mind shifts that we see in Spiritism, and the reason why we Spiritists are no longer so interested in conducting a lot of research as we did back in the 1850s to study this phenomena, because for us, we have already achieved multiple points of validation that leads us to believe that is indeed a fact, and we have taken the next step to internalize what the implications of reincarnation are. Because if we begin to accept that reincarnation is true, the great equalizer, as I like to think it, then we should also consider that the difference that divide us are very small. That if you are men today, you can be a woman tomorrow. If you're white today, you can be black or brown tomorrow. That if you're tall today, you may be short tomorrow. If you are fully able today, you may not be tomorrow. And that ought to grow in our hearts a certain sympathy for all human beings, regardless of language, space, orientation, identity, inclination, desire, or beliefs. That's what reincarnation starts to do with us, because tomorrow I could be you. Yesterday, maybe you or I. And when we begin to understand that and invite that into our hearts, everything starts to get equalized and we get closer to the idea of divine justice. And that is a fabulous moment. But reincarnation not only does that, not only brings us justice and equalizes things, but it also gives us a certainty that love is ever present and that the bonds of love that we form today are ever present. The people that you're with, in your family, or just simply here, if you look around, all these people are slowly being added to your roll of friends. And as you come back with them, as you eventually will, they become part of your universal family. And we are reminded that we had other friends who perhaps are not incarnate in the flesh here with us today, but may have shared a previous life with us, where they were also part of our environment. And that brings great joy to our heart, because it gives us the certainty that we are not alone. And that in fact, the circle of love that we have around us at any point in time is far superior to that which the eye can see. The people who love you are far more numerous than the people you think love you. Because we have parents, sisters, mothers, husbands, wives, friends from previous lives that to this moment are celebrating and cheering for you, so that you can be the best version of you today, so that you can have a better and happier tomorrow. So reincarnation is not only the great equalizer, but it also strengthens the bonds of love that we have built in this lifetime and reminds us that every new relationship that we build is eternal and potentially incredibly fulfilling. Can you imagine reaching a point where everybody you know is loved by you as much as you loved the person you love the most on this planet? Imagine the person that you love the most, and then look around and imagine how it would be to feel like that about everybody else. That is our future. It will come. It's only a matter of time. Reincarnation is an important part of it, and we hope that some of the details we've left here may entice you to dig a little deeper so that reincarnation can move from a belief to a certainty and fundamentally change your life. And we thank you for your time, and we hope that you have a blessed day.